Hi, I'm David Bush, Executive Director of Preservation Houston. Thank you for being with us this evening for this introduction to online resources. We're happy to be collaborating with Houston Public Library's Houston Metropolitan Research Center. I hope you're all familiar with the HMRC. It's a very valuable resource for our community. Tonight's presentation is part of the Bart Truxillo program series, named in memory of pioneer preservationist and Preservation Houston co-founder Bart Truxillo. Programs like these are one way Preservation Houston fulfills its mission to promote the preservation and appreciation of Houston's architectural and cultural historic resources through education, advocacy, and committed action. If you're not a member of Preservation Houston, you can join online at preservationhouston.org/join. And if you don't have a library card, you can apply online at houstonlibrary.org under My Account. Preservation Houston is supported in part by a grant from the City of Houston through Houston Arts Alliance. Now I'm happy to turn things over to Preservation Houston Programs Director, Jim Parsons.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening for an exciting workshop. We started planning this many months ago as an in-person event, but as we all know, things have kind of taken a turn. So we're happy to be able to do this online, and there's going to be some great information this evening. All that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter tonight, Samantha Bruer, who is the architectural archivist for the Houston Metropolitan Research Center at the Houston Public Library. She's got a lot of great info, so I won't stand in her way. And Sam, we'll see you in a bit for the Q&A.
Thank you, Jim. As he mentioned, my name is Samantha Bruer, or Sam. I'm an archivist specifically of architectural research and materials at the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, commonly referred to as HMRC, or sometimes even the Texas Room. Our institution was founded in 1976 as part of a multi-institution grant project to collect and house Houston's history in one location. We are one of 3 special collections centers for the Houston Public Library system. Our sister institutions are the African American Library at the Gregory School and Clayton Library Center for Genealogical Research. HMRC exists to locate, preserve, and make available to researchers the documentary evidence of Houston's history. We do this through donated archival material from individuals, businesses, religious, and civic groups whose records illustrate the city's history. The area I oversee specifically is the Stephen Fox Architectural Archives. This area, named in Fox's honor, is the 2nd largest architectural collection in Texas and one of the largest associated with the public library system in the country. We house over 150,000 sheets of architectural drawings from 85 archival collections, many of which also include project and office records for many Houston-based architectural firms, engineers, landscape architects, and just other built environment topics. So jumping into our topic for this evening of researching a historic property here in Houston, my first piece of advice is just not to recreate the wheel. If you don't have to, look for any previous documentation that may have already been completed. If your neighborhood or civic club has a library or librarian or a designated historian, look there for any information that may have been previously researched. There may be no information, or it may range from just a sentence or 2 to an entire history on your building. Just overall, a little caveat for this program is that many times I'll kind of interchangeably use house or building. This program was originally aimed towards housing specifically, but really all of the resources we'll talk about are beneficial to any type of building research in Houston. So if you live in a Houston Historic District, look at what information is available on the Preservation Office's website for your area, or look up the Texas Historical Commission's Atlas website to see if your property or your district's National Register documentation is digitized there. If you just happen to be researching a really early or prominent building in Houston, or even just taking these topics and applying them to areas outside of the city, some may have been documented with information, images, and measure drawings through the Historic American Building Survey, commonly known as HABS. But if you've looked for all these sources and you can't find anything, don't despair, because that's really why we're here tonight. So we can learn about some resources you can use without even leaving your home. And before you even start up your computer, take a look at the building itself, which can provide a lot of information about its history. Some of your building's physical clues can help to determine a rough estimate of the age or construction details for the structure. Age can be determined by the architectural style. Many basic style guides are available online through a quick Google search or through HPL books, which can be checked out using the current iteration for the most part, which is curbside pickup, or in reference sections at many of the branches that are doing the new express browsing option. The building materials of your property, such as the types of nails used, asbestos siding, or aluminum windows, can help date your property. Even exposed boards in attics or crawl spaces, or really any exposed structural area, can be a great tool too. Look for stampings or numbers or even receipts stuck to the wood, which can help indicate if the house's materials and potentially the overall design of the home were purchased from a retailer such as Sears or Montgomery Ward as a kit home, where all or part of the building was provided by the retailer and shipped to the site. Another tool to determine if this may have been your home's origins are any household features that may be original to the home, such as original hardware and fixtures. Commonly, bathtubs sold by Sears and Roebuck often featured an embossed SR on the tub. While this alone wouldn't determine the entire home's origins with the company, it would be just another clue in deciphering the building's past. And as an archivist, I'm always particularly fond of actual paper-based documents, but we're going to talk about some of those that have been translated into digital form, specifically some of the county records. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the Harris County Appraisal District, or HCAD. While their listed dates of construction are notoriously inaccurate for early Houston homes, this date can be a good jumping off point for your research if you have no other potential date to work with. Their website also provides the legal description for their property. This description lists the addition or other small identifying area for the property, which may be different from your larger subdivision, and provides just another research term, particularly as you explore newspaper records to learn more about the area's development. The ownership chain provided on HCAD's website from the present back to the 1980s is a great way to get started with our next resource, which is deed records. Deed records here are available through the Harris County Clerk's Office. To look up the deed, you will need the names of previous owners to trace that chain. Current records back to 1961 are available to search and view online for free. You just need to create an account on the Harris County Clerk's website. And I also recently learned about mechanics material liens that are available for the time period as well. These records will occasionally show the architect of the project. And a quick shout out to Marty Merritt for that information. Even archivists are learning new sources of information all the time. And half the time we work with researchers, we learn something from you. For records prior to the 1960s, contact the clerk's office for information. For tax records prior to the 1980s, those are available at the Harris County Archives. And often those records include a small image of the structure so you can see what it looked like at different periods. The staff there are always happy to help, primarily via email, especially in these times. So feel free to reach out to them for what information that they may have. The contact information for these places, as well as links to the other materials we'll talk about soon, are available in the handouts that Jim mentioned in the chat and will be sent out in a few days via email. So all of these aren't necessarily archival records, but you can find them in archives for the most part. So kind of looped them in all together as archival records. Starting with Sanborn Maps, you can see in the background lots of yellow blocks. That's just a general image of a page of a print Sanborn map. These were maps used by insurance companies to determine your insurance rate based on building material, size, openings, what your building was used for. They also based your rate on those same characteristics for the buildings around you. You know, maybe you lived in a residential, or maybe your house was in a residential area at the time, but then suddenly they built a fireworks factory next door. Obviously, your rates were going to increase. They are a beneficial tool to research properties, but here in Houston, a lot of the versions are hindered a bit, as most copies available were used as intended. And that actually means that every year or so, anytime a building or an area was altered or new construction happened, sheets were added to these books that reflected those changes. And that effectively erased the past few under layers of paper and paste. The versions we'll focus on tonight, those available digitally through an HPL subscription, have that limitation and were originally published in the 1920s and updated through the late 1950s and early 1960s. The digital version is also in black and white, commonly known as skeleton copies, which also makes determining the building material a little difficult, as you can see in the color-coded version. That's generally used to determine if it was a frame construction or a brick structure, et cetera, et cetera. And the next item, city directories, are very much like early phone books, and in some cases they were actually the phone books, as we'll see later. But however, they often provided a lot more information about those people and businesses listed within it. Many directories have general directories, which is essentially an alphabetical listing of individuals and business names. And then they many years also include a street directory, which lists each street alphabetically and then has each street number in order and list out who lives at each address. Generally, for Houston directories to have both types of directories in the same copy, it's about 1905, 1906 through about 1950. Once they hit the 60s, they tend to flip the other way and they only have a street index, or they start being a little more like a telephone book. But those midsections can be really great sources of information about who lived there and what their life was like and what their family was like. Using these books, you can look up an address in the street directory using maybe the rough HCAD estimate or a guess based on your neighborhood's age or your home style. And then search back 5 years to see if your home is there. If it's not, then go forward a couple years, see if it's listed, and that can kind of help you narrow down a date of construction using the city directories. Once you find your address and you have a resident's name, you can then flip forward to the beginning of the book and look specifically at them and to see, their spouse's name, what their occupation was, how many people were in the home, and sometimes their phone number or other information about them. You can actually even determine if they were an owner of the home or not. Owners are often listed by an O or an encircled O, similar to the common copyright emblem. Renters are sometimes noted with an R or an encircled R, but more often you can tell when a property was used as a rental with just the turnover visible, looking through multiple years of a directory, and there's a new person every year or every few years in a fairly consistent manner. Another way to determine if your house was a rental is just through rental advertisements found in our next resource, which are newspapers. The Portal to Texas History has newspapers as well as archival collections and other related materials digitized in one location from many archives and cultural organizations throughout Texas. For Houston, their newspaper coverage has the Houston Post until 1924, and that's really a primary cutoff date for a lot of records due to copyright. But it also has several smaller papers after that timeline, like the Southwestern Times. One of my particular favorite ways to search using the Portal to Texas History is their proximity search. And that allows you to search two separate words within so many words of each other, generally within one word of each other up to 19. So this is particularly helpful for finding houses via their cross streets rather than their street number. Or trying to find the connection between an architect and an address, or a person or business to their connection to a street name. And this resource is completely free. You can just Google Portal to Texas History, or the website is provided on the handouts, and it does not require a library card or any kind of paywall. One that does require a library card is the Houston Chronicle Microfilm, which is all digital microfilm. It's a paid subscription from HPL, which features searchable and browsable full-page view of the papers from their start in 1901 through 2017. This access gives researchers this tool gives researchers access to more records, particularly those in the mid-20th century, which we previously didn't have access to at HPL, and that the portal and other resources can't provide given their limitations. The Daily Court Review, available through HPL Database Newspaper Archive, is a great resource for building permits, utility permits, and more official announcement type newspaper ads from the mid-1920s to the 1970s. The database isn't always the easiest to search. It is getting better all the time. Every few weeks I get on and it's much better than it was before. And that step-by-step guide to how to use those resources provided should make it a lot easier to navigate, and you can always reach out if you're having trouble. The Houston Public Library Digital Archives is the area where HPL's 3 research centers provide access to just a fraction of our materials digitally. Most useful here are maps, including subdivision maps, photographs, books, and periodicals, and we're adding to that all the time. There's also a small selection of architectural drawings featured there as well. And while that is an HPL-specific resource, you do not need a library card to access that, and even some materials are available for download. So to kind of illustrate how these tools and resources work in your research, we're going to use an example to highlight how to do these things and what kind of results you may have. This is house pictured here is our primary example at 1802 Harvard. This house was constructed in 1892 using an adapted plan, originally designed and published by Tennessee-based architect George Barber. Many houses of the time, and even into today, are built using published plans, which means many houses around the country have the same plans, which are translated into form by local builders. This house is a great tool to show how previous documentation can be applied, but it also has a lot of results in our searching materials. So that is a great way to highlight their specific properties as well. Over the next few slides, we'll look at information that can be found online that you can use to discover information about your own building. Of course, your results will vary for each building based on the design, construction date, prominence of the builder or local or the early owner, and just the location in town. However, every bit of information you find is key to uncovering your building's history. And on this page, we're going to look at some early city directories for that house specifically and kind of learn how to read them and access those little bits of information that are hidden in the pages. Let me try and grab a little pointer here. Bear with me just a second. Okay, hopefully you all can see this little mouse arrow. So first we're going to look at this 1900 Houston City Directory, General Directory. Again, that's that alphabetical section. The 1900 directory only has the people section or the General Directory. So you don't have that wonderful street index to go through. So we had to look at other years to kind of find a person's name to use as a search tool. Let me catch up to where I am. So just looking at this record, the resident is Harry P. Mansfield. In some of the years we looked at, he was listed as Henry. He works in real estate and loans with an office at 305.5 Main Street. His office phone number was through Citizens Phone Company at 498. And the way we determine the Citizens phone is the C here right before the phone number. And in the very beginning of the General Directory, there's a small guide to abbreviations and things that you wouldn't normally be able to determine. Not every single abbreviation is listed there, so you kind of have to guess or just learn from experience from looking at multiple years and make some assumptions about what it might mean. So looking at the record again, his residence was on the northeast corner of 18th Avenue and Harvard. Again, using other records, we determined that this is the same house. And his home phone number was 703, but the second ring, due to the party line that was active at the time. So in this middle section, we're going to look at the 1910 directories, starting with the street index, and which is, again, generally at the back of the directory. We looked up Harvard Street, then the 1800 block, and then specifically for 1802, and you can see that the current resident is S. Allen Kincaid. And then we flipped to the front of the book, looked up Kincaid in the General Directory, and discovered more information about him. And you can see that in this bottom record here. He works in room or office 304 in the Scanlon building downtown in real estate and investments. That seems to be a common theme with this building in particular. The office phone is the Preston Switch office, 3631. He, again, lives at 1802 Harvard, Houston Heights. The small 3 indicates that there are 3 members of the household, and their home phone number was the Taylor Switch office 319. And in this final directory note for the address is from 1922, and you can see that the resident was Alex Petty. In the General Directory, we get the bonus of not only the primary resident, again, generally most often male, but other family members as well. In the initial record for Alex, you learn that his wife's name is Lita at H. Petty, as well as confirming their address. And many years of the directory provide this information on spouses or even former spouses. Sometimes if you see the listing for a single woman or Mrs. So-and-so, it'll list the name of their deceased husband. Just a generic example, Smith, Mary, parentheses, widow, or simply WID of Ben R. This particular record, while it doesn't provide a lot of information about his occupation or his office location, it does provide additional entries for presumably the couple's sons who also live in the home, but are kind of starting to make their way out into the world. So Harris and Petty is a checker at W.C. Munn department store. And their, again, presumably their son, Thomas, is a student at what is now Rice University. Okay. Sticking with newspapers, this next batch used 1802 Harvard to show how you can find rental advertisements and just other information about the residents. This Fairview, Central Park, Houston Heights example is a business ad from Alex Petty in 1916, but it lists his address as 1802 Harvard, which gives us him at that address 6 years prior to the last city directory entry that we looked at the last page. So again, that kind of eliminates several years that you have to look up in the directory to know who was there at that time period. Newspapers are also the most likely source for everyday information about the life of the home and the residents and what was going on around them and what kind of environment they were living in. These include party descriptions, social visits, people coming in from out of town, birth announcements or weddings held at the home, or people getting married that were associated with the property, and even deaths of residents, such as this obituary, which is quite a bit later in 1950 for Cora Wynn. So we know from this record she lived there at least in 1950. You can even find some fun things like so-and-so lost their cow, or this one specifically under livestock, where residents of the home were selling fox terrier puppies. So learning little ins and outs of the residents that you wouldn't find in other sources. And these small details can provide a fuller picture of what life was like in your home or your neighborhood 15, 50, or even 100 years ago. Other newspaper articles and notices can help to find changes over time. The first clipping on this slide is from one of my favorite online resources, which is now just recently made available to search remotely instead of coming into an HPL location, which is the newspaper archive. Using it, you can search several local papers, including the University of Houston's Daily Cougar and the Daily Court Review. And I mentioned that briefly, but the Daily Court Review is a great source for building permit information, utility permits, and other more official listings from the 20s into the 70s. While not every building or utility permit is listed there, it has great coverage, and it can be a useful tool to find information about a building's construction or any changes that were made over time. In this clipping, a building permit was issued to Bart Truxillo, who we mentioned at the top of the program, who was the home's owner at the time and a general champion of preservation across the city of Houston, to remodel the frame residence and kind of start to get it to what it is today. This note also lists what the permit was for, remodel frame residence, the permit number, and again, that legal description that we talked about earlier, and the value of the project being done, so $20,000 in 1975. This small box here, again, this is a Sanborn map clipping specifically for the 1802 Harvard residence. As I mentioned before, the digital version is a skeleton copy or in black and white, and this can limit seeing what the building material is, but you can always find that in other ways or come in and look at a physical copy either with us or some earlier ones that are available for the Harris County Archives. But you can determine a lot of information without even looking at the home or seeing an image or seeing it in person just from this record here. And I'll kind of walk you through a few of those things so you can get a general idea of just starting to learn to read one of these. So the 2 and the 1 here in different sections of the home indicate that the property is primarily 2-story with a 1-story section at the rear. And the D indicates that the home is a dwelling. It's generally D for dwelling, S for store, et cetera, et cetera. And each volume of the Sanborn Maps will have a key. So it can kind of guide you through those symbols and what abbreviations stand for. Again, one of those little symbols is the X here in the corner, which indicates that both areas of the home and this outbuilding we'll talk about in just a second. Oh, excuse me, don't listen to that. Just the X's on the main building, that the house had a shingle roof. So little pieces of information that you can garner just from looking at this briefly and learning more about how to use them with the key. But onto this little outbuilding. Just from the Sanborn, you learned that there was an outbuilding here, at least into the 1950s. When this was last updated. And again, it was also 2-story. And I believe instead of an X, this is an A, which would indicate that it was used as a garage for automobile, as well as the shed as written on the page. And just another illustration using a completely separate property. I recently had a reference question, and it was for a building at 2200 Cypress Street. And I could find some modern references to that property, but looking historically, I could find, well, nothing, absolutely. So I went to the Sanborns, and it actually, because it was not necessarily a commercial building, but a business, it provided a lot of information about who owned it, and when it was constructed, what the building material was, just specifically written out. And, that's going to be only for specific buildings, generally bigger buildings or commercial buildings. But again, it can be a great resource that you didn't expect to find. But most importantly, for my research, I learned that there they listed the address as 504 Frio Street, which is, I'm not sure was ever a completely through street. But looking that up in the newspaper and other resources, I still wasn't able to find much. So I just went with the other even numbers that would have been neighboring and learned that the address was actually 506 Frio, and that garnered a lot more results and provided information that could be used and pass on to the patron. So, you think of it as like a resource for learning about the structure of the building, but it can really provide a lot of valuable information that you didn't expect to find. Another example of how this can be found in even a city directory is the street Altic on the east side of town was originally Yoakum. And when that change was made to change the street address, for several years, both under Yoakum and Altic, it referenced the other. So you could direct people to that address, and it wasn't just, oh, suddenly that street's gone. There's a trail of when it changed and how to find the information. Those houses just didn't disappear. However, there may be times when you're researching and you find very limited information on your property. Some very basic city directory mentions and not a thing in newspapers. And, for those situations, I suggest just broadening the scope of your research. If you can't determine what the people who lived in your house did for a living, look at their neighbors. Odds are they were the same race, religion, financial status, etc., to those who lived in your home. You can also broaden the search out to learn more about the development of your neighborhood rather than your home specifically, and that'll generally provide more information. The above map here in the corner and the streetcar image document the Heights' history prior to its annexation to the city of Houston, and both of those images can be seen in greater detail on the Houston Public Digital Archives. And I hope this brief walkthrough of property research examples gives you a bit of a jumping off point to start your own projects. And as you look through these resources while researching your own property, please feel free to reach out to me or just HMRC in general for any assistance. Or if you hit a wall in locating information, we'll try and help you dig through the resources to find something noteworthy. Hopefully your research will be fruitful and you will find a lot of information to document the building's history. And this final slide is to provide a few options for what to do when you come to the conclusion of your project. Just what to do with the information that you find. The most common and not inclusive is to hold the knowledge that you've gained. You know, this was kind of a personal journey to learn more about your property, learn more about this home or building that you care about, and now you've uncovered a bit of a mystery. But you also may want to display materials that you found along the way to illustrate the history of the property, including any images you found, architectural drawings, neighborhood maps, or even advertisements. And you may also find information that is so fascinating or historically important that you feel your building is significant enough to warrant the steps to write a National Register of Historic Places nomination and or to be just recognized officially by the city. And whichever route you choose, that's up to you. And the information you uncover is just another facet of the city and your property's history. Thank you all again for attending. And if you'd like to contact myself or the staff at Preservation Houston, please reach out to the contacts above in this PowerPoint. And for the rest of the time tonight, Saneea, Lynn, and I will be available for any questions you can have. And I appreciate you guys attending, at least virtually, and I hope to see you at HMRC soon. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Sam. This was great. There's a lot of information there for sure. And I think it shows you that starting a research project like this is really the tip of the iceberg. And I think one of the, the little clip that you showed about the family that was selling puppies out of the house on Harvard makes me think that one of the most fun things about looking into the history of a property is all those side things that are not relevant to anything but.
Yeah.
And just the random newspaper stories about the things that people got up to, because the newspapers used to report on like everything that you did.
Yes, yes. Anytime you were coming or going from town, you couldn't move without some kind of report, especially as you moved up the social ladder.
Yes, the more important you were, the more they told. It was kind of a weird classist version of Facebook, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. We really appreciate you putting this together, Sam. It's a great start for anybody looking to do research. We do have Saneea Sakhyani, who's Preservation Houston's Community Outreach Coordinator, and Lynn Chong from FW Heritage. Saneea and Lynn both have done a lot of property research using these resources and others, and are both experts in uncovering the hidden history of properties. So we've got a good trio to help answer your questions. So going to, let's see, and Sam, this is a good question from Marty Merritt, who is another expert in uncovering the history of all sorts of properties. Marty noticed that in one of your slides, you displayed a picture of a Texas Associated General Contractors bulletin, and those are really valuable. If you would mention what those are and talk about if there's any way to access those online.
There are a few years. I believe it's partially 1922 through 1924, available on the Hpl Digital Archives. And those are a statewide publication that was put out, again, by the General Contractors Association to highlight potential work for contractors of various kinds, from like projects that were being pitched or even kind of on the drawing board, to kind of the recently awarded contracts that you could know if your competitor got the job, or if if you were a subcontractor, something might be coming down the line to you soon. And again, because of copyright, there's only a few years available online, but it's if you come into the Texas room, which we are now open just for research, but you can come in and see the print copies up to an incomplete record for 1937, which is the ending of that resource. One other highlight of that, it's not the easiest to search. You have to search by location. So you'd search by Houston in each of those sections. And then you're sometimes it'll have street address, but sometimes it's across streets, or you're just going on a vague name or abbreviated name for the project.
And I just jumped on to say that as far as we can tell, the HMRC has the only set of the general contractors bulletins that we know of. We've talked to people in Dallas who drive down to use them. And if you see people at the table sitting with orange books running, yes. running little cards down the line because they're in very fine print, that's what they're doing.
It's a lot of fine print.
A lot of fine print.
Very tiny. Saneea, I know that you have a lot of experience with this, and maybe you can take this one. We have a question about the difference between the city directory and the street directory, and it's not like it's two different things. It's two features of the same book, right?
Yes, that's correct. So the city street directory is a way, it's a way to locate the property residents and just kind of get a confirmation of who lived there, as well as to see if there was a particular owner in the year that you were searching in. So if I just kind of wanted to get that sense of, all right, I'm tracking down a house, I'm trying to find out who lived there, if there was an owner, when did it first show up in the city directories, and I have a sense of, perhaps it's around 1910, 1920, then I would personally start with the street directories, which tend to be towards the back. It depends on the year, but typically they're towards the back of the city directories. And then you search by address. And sometimes if this, it might be by neighborhood, but typically it's by address. So if I was looking at, 1802 Harvard, I would go to H, it's in alphabetical order. Then I would go down, find 1802, I would see that there was either a owner or a resident. If there was an owner, there's typically a circle with a little circle inside of it. If there was a resident, it typically doesn't have that. Now, if I wanted to find out more information, as Sam had mentioned in the presentation, then I would kind of use the city directory. And that is also by alphabetical order, but it's by last name or it's by name. So if I was searching for Bart Truxillo, then I would go through the section, get to T, go down, find the last name, confirm the first name. And that might tell me, a lot of different information, such as where they worked. It might have an office number, right? We saw this in the presentation, or residence, and that kind of information. So these are both part of the same, source, the city directory, but they just give you different information. And they're both useful. And sometimes you may not be able to locate the person that you're looking for, or you don't know who you're looking for. So it might be more helpful to start in the street directory, and that can give you a name that then you can go and search by.
Yeah, that's true, because a lot of time you start off not having any idea who lived in the house. So finding the house and then working backwards from there. And this is a good jumping off point, I think, for another question. And Lynn, I think this would be an interesting one for you. What's the first place that you look when you start researching the history of a property? Do you have a first stop?
Yeah, I always start with the Sanborn. Only because number one, it's the database that I use is a colored one, and I want to. It's the first place that I start. And I start because it's colored, it gives you a lot of information, it tells you about the shape of the house, and some of those X's and numbers that Samantha was referring to, it tells you information like that. The other reason why I use the Sanborn is that it's kind of the prettiest thing to look at in this research process. And I just want to interject this piece of advice, I think, to all the researchers and the potential on all the potential research that you guys, the attendees, will be doing. This research process does not happen overnight. The information is tedious. It requires a lot of patience, but I want to tell everybody, don't give up. You know, as you're doing this research, there will be days where you find nothing. And there will be, but on the day that you find that something, you know, you feel like doing somersaults in your house. And that's why I always start with the Sanborn. Like I said, it's the prettiest thing to look at. And everything else from there is quote unquote boring, but you know, it's all important information.
And Sam did a good job of explaining kind of what the purpose of the Sanborns were. And then I think, Lynn, you picked up on something else important. What the Sanborns can tell us, in addition to the little, you know, X's and letters and everything, they're really useful for finding the shape of a house. So if you're looking at a property to try to see how it might have been added onto or how it might have been altered over the years, you can compare the modern footprint with the Sanborn footprint. It's always amazing to me to think that those guys walked around and drew everything by hand and their proportions are right. I mean, if they show, you know, that your house was closer to the property line than the house next door, you can pretty much take that to the bank that was the way that it was.
Correct.
I just can't imagine how they did it, but it's an invaluable resource. And whether you look at the ones that are in color or the ones in black and white, depending on what year and what area you're looking at, they both have great information, but the color ones are prettier.
Yeah, I always also follow up looking at the Sanborn maps with sending an email to the Harris County archivist. I have had a lot of success with her sending me the building permits because as you look at the Sanborn maps over the years, the shape of the house may or may not change. But when it does change, you're really curious about when the addition happened. You know, was it permitted? You know, who bought the permit, how much those permits were at those times. And I've had a lot of success emailing the Harris County archivist, and she sent me copies of those permits or those drawings.
That's a good point. The Harris County archives, again, it can be hit or miss depending on the property, but
yes,
when it's a hit, you can find some really great information. And I should add, because I've used this a lot, when you start looking at the Sanborn and you start seeing all those little symbols that they used and they start to not make sense, at the beginning of each year's set of Sanborn maps, there is a key that explains what all of that is. And if you don't want to find that, you can just Google Sanborn map key, and there are plenty of them available online that'll tell you what the colors mean and what the little letters mean and what the X's mean. They even did hash marks to show you where windows were in commercial buildings, and there's just all kinds of stuff. Linda Christ has a good question, and I'll send this one back to you, Sam. What about, and I'm going to expand on it a little bit. Linda asked, what about cases where street addresses have changed? But I would also add, what about cases where street names have changed? Because that happens a lot too.
Yeah, starting with street number, again, as Lynn said, one of my favorite things to do is go to the Sanborns. Often they will list, or sometimes if a property is relatively recently to the update changed address number, they'll have two numbers listed kind of stacked on top of each other. The number that is closest to the house, or occasionally you'll see it where it's just bigger, is the address that is currently in use, and whereas the smaller number, the one further away from the property, is the one that was formerly used. As far as street names, there's a couple of great books that we use in the Texas room. One is actually two editions of the same book, are just like histories of the of why streets were named a certain way, but in that there's an index of when certain certain streets changed names, as well as just maps. And as I mentioned, there was kind of the vague example of Altic, formerly being Yoakum on the east side of the city. Those are listed in the city directory. When those street names changed, like Altic, formerly Yoakum, and then it has, this is completely wrong, but between 8th Avenue and Telephone Road. It lets you know which area of the city that is in case you have a street like Yoakum where it never really connects all the way through, but it's in different parts of the city. But it also keeps for several years that the former name, or when you went to Yoakum for that section of the city, it would say, please see Altic. So that can help you trace that. And then again, I would say to the previous question, the first thing I look in is newspapers, kind of tracking things there. Sometimes it's announced, sometimes it's not, but it can really help in multiple areas of the search.
And there are a couple of kind of milestone dates to remember in that. I want to say it was 1893, Houston adopted a modern street numbering plan where we went to 100 blocks. And before that, everything was just kind of numbered willy-nilly. So if you're looking at a property prior to that, you'll find that the numbers have changed. And there have been several periods of like massive street name change in the city. When the Heights was annexed, that was one because we had numbered streets elsewhere. And then when the Heights numbered streets came in, they changed. And then from the 20s through about the 60s, we did a lot of connecting streets together to try to make traffic flow better. And you see a lot of names change at that point, in addition to just random neighborhood changes. So I did put in the chat, there is a list of some of the street names in Houston that have changed over the years that somebody collected. And so that can be useful too. There is some interest in the city directories, and the city directories are fascinating because they are phone books, but they're not phone books. And I think not as we would understand them. So if anybody wants to take this one, Mary Hollis asks a couple of questions. How did you get into the city directory? Did you have to pay to get in it? And she notes that normal people very often didn't have their phone numbers listed, but businesses did. But I think that's because it wasn't a phone book like we think of a phone book. Sam, do you want to start that one?
Sure. I'd say that, the city directories are in different places, different fees. Currently, because of COVID, it's been a hindrance on research and life in general, but it has provided the library with access to Ancestry Library remotely for users. So you can use that to find many more years of these city directories. We have a few years, again, kind of cut off arbitrarily with copyright in 1923, 1924 on the Hpl Digital Archives. But with Ancestry, you can find a lot more years and look up there. And at the moment, there is no paywall, which there normally is that restriction. Again, if you go through the library website with a MyLink card, as far as the other, I don't know that much about that. So,
I think the important thing to remember on the city directories is they weren't. So as soon as enough people got phones, we started having phone books we would recognize. But the city directories were actually aimed at businesses and merchants, and they weren't to let you call everybody in town. They were to show you everybody who lived in town, so you could target people by neighborhood, or you could target people by, kind of look up people's profession, that kind of thing. And everybody didn't get the city directory. The city directories were expensive, and you had to pay to have one. I'm sure that there was a way to pay to boost your prominence within the directory. But I mean, if you look back at the prices, even in the 1920s, I think they were $25 for a city directory, which was a lot of money in the 1920s. So they weren't something that we would have necessarily.
Yeah, and if you look at in the front of the directories, it will say, come to the Chamber of Commerce office and look them up. They weren't everywhere. And the difference between them and the phone book was, remember, a lot of people didn't have phones. Mm. And if they didn't have phones, they weren't going to be in the phone book, but they were in the city directories. Yeah, but it's also amazing how willing people were to share that information. And just,
it's also true.
Because my understanding was they would, just, it was a private company and they would just, ask.
Go door to door.
Yeah, whatever. And then people would tell you.
Lynn, what were you going to say?
I think Mary's question was more about how does everybody have entry into the city directory? Was there somebody that went door to door, interviewed the people who lived there, how many children, and then everybody got a chance to go into the city directory? Or did you have to pay to get in? Or did you, I think that was her question.
Yeah, it was more everybody.
It was everybody.
Everybody was in, and businesses could pay to get like a bold listing or whatever, which I think, well, I don't know if they still make phone books, but you could still do that in the phone book a few years ago. And you could pay to have an ad in the city directory, but I think it was everybody was in. And some years you would see that there would be a little bell by people's names, which would indicate that they had a telephone, but it wouldn't tell you what their telephone number was. So
privacy laws.
Privacy laws. Plus, you could call Gladys down at
you
could call Gladys at the phone exchange and say, "I'm trying to get Sam Bruer," and Gladys would say, "I'll hook you right up." That would be it.
But they're really the most, as far as printed goes, they're really the most comprehensive you can get.
Saneea, I want to send a question your way. We have a couple who are beginning the process of selling their home in Cherryhurst, and they were interested in finding out how we would recommend starting the research into the history of their house. So, I mean, we've heard Sanborns, we've heard city directories. What would you do if you were looking into a house?
That's a really great question. And I commend you guys for wanting to do some research on your house before selling it. And I think it comes down a lot to what kind of information you're you'd like to find and what you're kind of trying to do with the information. Because, one thing Preservation Houston does as a public service is that we help property owners start the research and also write a nomination report for a City of Houston landmark or protected landmark designation. These are two historic designations that you can get through the City of Houston. And that's something that myself, and Kathleen Nuzzo, who also works at Preservation Houston, that's something that is a project that we really love to work on. And so part of that research is, gathering the built date, looking into past owners, looking into the newspaper archives and seeing what we can find out about the property. So if you're, wanting to start with something like that, like basic information, where I start is actually HCAD, the appraisal district. Now, not for the build date, as Sam mentioned, is notoriously incorrect for past homes, but since it can also be useful to kind of get a general sense of like the property's basic statistics. Now, since it's your home, you may not want to start there, but for somebody who's kind of like just starting the process, they get a sense of where exactly their home is located. The ownership history gives some of the later owners. But for you guys, I would say a great place to start is actually the city directories. If you have a general sense of the built date based off of the neighborhood and when a lot of those houses were built, you can kind of start in the street directory and track down some owners, look into them and see what you can find out. That's a great place to start. The the Houston Metropolitan Research Center through the Hpl membership, the Houston Chronicle Archives are a great place to start as well. If you type in your property address and see what comes up based by the oldest listing, it's also a good idea, a good starting place to see how maybe when your property was first listed in the newspapers, which is interesting. It might have all kinds of random information, like who lived there, what they were doing. They might be selling something. So that also gives you kind of a good foundation to work off of, because once you have like an estimate date, you have like an a name of a owner, it's easier to then use more and more resources to get kind of a narrative down. But we at Preservation Houston, we're happy to help you get started on that research as well. So please feel free to contact us, and we'd be happy to help you get started that way.
Okay, and it occurs to me, Saneea, as you were saying that, one just general search hint, especially when you're searching the Chronicle Archives, if you're searching your address, put it in quotation marks. Yes. Because that lets you search 123 Main Street as a phrase, because otherwise you're going to get every article that ever had 123 or Main or Street in it, and it'll drive you crazy.
Yes, so thank you,
Jim. You want to find something specific. Yeah.
For sure. Please do that.
Yeah, it helps a lot. And remember that sometimes the text scanning that they've used for the newspaper archives, this doesn't apply just to the Chronicle, but to all old newspapers. It's not completely accurate. So you may be searching for, 1802 Harvard, and it might give you 1602 Harvard. So just pay attention to what you're looking at. If you see something that seems like an outlier, it probably is an outlier for a reason. Lynn, I'm going to ask you this one. We have a question from Edgar Gilharo, who says, do you know where you could find original architectural plans for his home, which was built in Lindale Park in 1940? Have you ever had luck finding old plans for any of the houses that you've worked on?
I have never done research for a home so new. 1940
right.
is new. But even I have never found original architectural plans for any of the houses that I've researched. I have been able to find the shape of the house. I've been able to find building permits for the house, but never any original architectural plans for the house. Okay. And also all the houses that I've researched, none of them have been Sears kit homes. So, if they were, then, you can use that as a jumping off point to try and find the architectural plans. But I don't have experience in trying to find the architectural plans for any of my homes. Not a full set of plans.
I guess I should ask, the lady who works among all the architectural plans in the city of Houston. Sam, what's the likelihood that somebody's going to be able to find plans for a particular home?
Very small. Overall, especially if your house is very similar to your residence and it was done by a developer, odds are it was just general plans by a builder who knew how to build a home. Something they followed and kind of did variations on in different areas, or a developer had a staff architect who often was, sometimes their name, sometimes they were pretty much nameless and probably underpaid, who did like these bulk plans, or they bought plans. And that's something that happens today. But this is probably the most common question I get at HMRC is, hey, where are the plans for my home? If you had later work done very haphazardly since the 80s, there may be something available through the city. Maybe. You can always reach out, public information request. I will have a caveat of HMRC is not official City of Houston archival repository. Any city records we have are by donation or saved from potential destruction. So really, unfortunately, it's very unlikely, and it's even very possible that your home never had a true set of architectural plans. It was just some kind of copy that they used for multiple properties. And, people now, I'm sure, but definitely then just knew how to build houses. And for a lot of, I don't want to say less prominent, but less prominent homes or areas, it just necessarily, it doesn't exist. If you think like my house is actually wonderful and surely there was an architect who designed this house, the AIA National they have a archives, and Nancy Headley, she had my job a long time ago. She's actually the AIA archivist, and they have a website. It's very hard to find. So if you email me, I can send you the link to that. And they have an index of historical architects. And they're indexed by state and have a little information. And you can, if you happen to run across the name of the architect, you can always look them up in that section. And sometimes, if there's not very much information there, you can ask Nancy to upload their membership file. And she's fairly quick about that, but sometimes it does take a bit. But again, that's going to be a fairly prominent home. If I may, I'm going to go on a little rant about my favorite and only female architect currently represented at HMRC, Betty Jo Jones. Her collection, again, mostly stock plans or ranch style suburban homes, vaguely 60s through 80s, is the best collection we have at HMRC for everyday homes, things that you wouldn't necessarily, or if you're informed, you wouldn't necessarily think would have had an architect. Her collection is amazing, and just a fraction of those have client names or addresses listed. But especially if you live in Conroe, Friendswood, Pasadena, check our database and see if maybe something there. But overall, that's not an area that, if they ever existed, they probably don't exist anymore. But it's likely they never existed.
Yeah, which is a sad realization to come to, because you would like to think all those things you would like to think that people took good care of those records, but we've heard stories, and I'm sure you have too, of architecture firms where they dumped all of their papers in the trash when the office closed down, which is very sad. Marty Merritt is coming in clutch with some good research tips, so I just want to run through those here. Marty notes that generally house plans are only available from original homeowners, which is true. He says, as far as he knows, the only true archive of plans belongs to the Meyerland Civic Club. And that's going to be, again, Meyerland would be pretty recent in the history that we're talking about since the 1950s. I would also note, Marty, on that topic, if you're lucky enough to live in a house that was like a builder featured house, or like on a Street of Dreams or something like that, sometimes in the paper, they would have those plans just to show, like, here's what your house could be like. So, I mean, you might luck into that. But, if you go back far enough, I was thinking about Cherryhurst. A lot of the Cherryhurst homes were built by common developers. And so they've got either the same plan or variations on a plan. If you go into the Heights and you start looking at old bungalows, it's kind of, there's that bungalow plan that shows up over and over and over again. So you may not be able to find the exact drawings, but you can, with context clues, often kind of think about what has happened to your house over the years. Marty also notes that the Chronicle Archives have a good proximity search, and you can search an owner's name and a street, but not necessarily the exact address. And if you go into the Chronicle search, you'll see you can add a lot of different search terms on there, and you can kind of drill down as much as you want to. Marty, also going back to the General Contractors Bulletin, the AGC office on Tacoma has a set of the printed ones, which you can look at. And Randy Pace notes the Clayton Library has bound city directories in addition to the HMRC, and Harris County Archives also has a set of city directories. And Randy also notes, if you live in a house that's architect designed, and you can find out where the architect's alma mater is, sometimes they will have donated their papers there. A lot of Texas architects' papers ended up in the Alexander Archives in Austin. Not necessarily house plans, but maybe.
Yeah, there are definitely some. And a note for that AIA directory, historical directory. Slowly, as myself and other architectural archivists around the country process our records and even get the time to notify them, when you look up those architects, if their holdings are somewhere, we try to let them know that, oh, the holdings for John Chase that are at HMRC. That's a slow process, but that is an ultimate goal, so that when you do find those people on the list, you can, if they have records, you can find them a little easier.
David, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, one thing I would say, if you have an old house and a lot of people, it surprised me how often people have found the drawings rolled up in a closet up in the attic. And we get the call where it's like, does anybody really want these? I'm just going to throw them away. It's like, no, no, no. So if you happen to find that kind of stuff, please call Sam or please call us. We'll likely turn it over to Sam. But there's stuff out there that sometimes is surprising, that is just rolled up in a closet.
Yes. Or even in some crawl spaces, maybe you'll find some of those original features or something that someone just tucked away. But definitely, if you find something neat or that has your architectural plans, or even a basic floor plan, please let me know. And I would appreciate at least knowing it exists, if not getting it in our collections.
Well, and it's the safest place for it to be at the HMRC. It's going to be cared for and it's going to be accessible, which both are important things. But that does lead to another question, Sam. If, let's say, I'm researching my house and I find something really cool that I think you would want, how do I find out if you would want it?
Talk to me. Shoot me an email, give me a call, and we'll talk about it. Sometimes we get people who, just do a search of everything that could possibly be relevant to their home. They get really excited about the results, even if they're not stupendous, and then they want to hand over a whole packet of all of their research. Generally, that's harder to place for us. It may go into a vertical file, but often that's just duplicated material. If we just get a whole stack of city directories results, that's not necessarily something we're interested in, because we have 1866 to 2021 city directories there for people to search. But if you find something substantial, or if you think, it's a really interesting tidbit that, it's worth noting, definitely let me know. If nothing else, I'll, exclaim and say, that's amazing and you did good work. But if not, we can always talk about how to incorporate it into HMRC's collections.
It never hurts to get some validation from an archivist. Yeah, so we can all use that.
And those are my favorite researchers, the most enthusiastic.
It's easy to get excited over this stuff.
Yes.
Lynn, thinking about some of the work that you've done researching in the First Ward, you found it valuable to talk to people who have lived in the neighborhood for a long time as well, right?
Correct. We have a small number of neighbors who have been here for 40, 50 years, whose grandparents were here, who have since passed. But they do have either memories or stories about the houses or the buildings or the structures that we refer to. And some of them actually have old photographs. So sometimes when you're having conversations with neighbors, it may not have been a photograph from when they were alive, but it's their grandparents' collection of photographs and, their treasure. And they can give you clues on, how the building once was and how it has changed, or even how, the street front has changed. And it also gives you information about the homes that we've lost. Because a photograph from 50 years ago, we may have lost, 3 out of the 10 houses on that block, but now we have a photographic evidence of it. So it's really good to talk to your neighbors. And people love to talk. Once you start a conversation, if you manage to get, the person on the right day, they will have stories. But on that same note, every story that they tell you should also be backed up by as much research as you can do. because sometimes, these stories have, grown an extra layer of colorfulness, if that's the best way to put it. So, whatever stories they tell you, make notes, keep them in your head, but try and do the research to back up what they're telling you. But it's a good jumping off point.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Sometimes you hear a story where you think it's part urban legend, and then you realize there's actually some truth to it that like you said, just kind of snowballed over the years, but you can figure out what the true part of it is.
Yeah. Can I do a shout out here? There's one of our attendees here. Her name is Amanda Pate, and she is correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda. I think it's her grandparents that used to live in First Ward on the 1700 block of Shern. And we became friends when she found us, FW Heritage, and the work that we do. And she has been a source of information for me on houses in the First Ward and on the 1700 block of Shern. And, her family has owned multiple houses in the neighborhood. She doesn't live in Houston. But she has a website that she's put together that has photos and stories and the history of her family and their history in the First Ward. So you just never know who you end up talking to and the plethora of information they have done on their houses and their family. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And yeah, Amanda's been sending in some great tidbits here. Her mom was born at 1717 Shern.
Yes.
And I was going to give Amanda my own shout out because Amanda noted that you can also find sketches in newspaper articles of some houses. So you, even if there's not a photo, you may be able to find a line drawing every house as it originally looked. So going back to that question about house plans and all of that. All right. And we've got two questions to wrap up here. Sam, I'm going to put this one to you, and then Saneea, I will send the last one your way. So Sam, Nancy Braddock says, do these basic types of online research resources also apply to properties in other parts of Texas? And what would you do if you're researching a property in another city? Would you start with a local library?
Quite often, I would start with the local library. Even if they don't happen to have like a local history section, they themselves maybe or quite often are researchers or genealogists who have an interest and knowledge of the local area. And they can identify area-specific digital resources that may be helpful. But some of the tools that we talked about today, these digital Sanborns, those are, all of Texas is available, so not just Houston. And through Ancestry, it's, I believe, if not every state, most states are available. The Portal to Texas History, again, is a statewide resource. Great coverage for Galveston, but even things as far away as Amarillo and Dallas and everywhere in between. So those two specifically are great tools. And many states have digital libraries in general, and you can always Google a state and what resources they have online, and genealogy websites, any kind of Wikipedia page, they often list local resources, and they're one of the best sources, I think, of people who know their area and resources are available where, either digitally or in person. So just looking for that area and, Googling around with local history or property research, genealogy. And again, the counties often have specific information with them rather than at the local city level.
And county historical societies in some smaller cities, their county or city historical society may fill the role that like the HMRC fills here. So that's worth checking out. Lynn, you had something to add?
Yeah, it just came to my mind. I remembered one area of information source that we didn't discuss is the local cemetery. They may or may not have the information, but you sometimes, if you take a walk at the cemetery and you find a family plot, that's a lot of information there from who they are, who the family's member, where they were born. And it gives you a name, not just the one name, but it gives you 10 names as a jumping off point.
Yeah, that's a good point. And some cemeteries will have their own records as well.
Correct.
And one other quick thing, when I'm not sure what Clayton's open, Clayton Library has a lot of city directories from other Texas cities.
Yeah. A couple of other resources. Marty mentioned newspaperarchive.com. There's also newspapers.com. Both of those, you can search newspapers from all over the country. And one interesting thing, if you're looking for Houston-specific things, some years of the Houston Post are on there, but Galveston would often cover things that were happening in Houston. Mm-hmm. Sometimes Dallas and San Antonio covered things that were happening in Houston, so you never know where it might turn up. And Amanda Pape, I think it was, mentioned familysearch.org, which is run by the Mormon Genealogical Library. It's a free resource. I see it sort of as kind of sitting side by side with Ancestry. They have a little bit different things, but Ancestry is a paid resource and Family Search is a free resource, and they're both good to try for. It just never hurts to hit all those resources and see if you turn anything up on different ones. And if you look back in the chat, and we'll email this out too, I mentioned the Preservation Houston online resource page, which has Ancestry.com, Family Search, a lot of these other non-HPL resources that we've talked about. So using the list that Sam put together and then that list should get you a good ways to where you want to be. Saneea, I'm going to send the last question your way. And this is one that I know you're going to be excited to answer. What about when a house has moved? Because houses used to move a lot.
Oh my gosh. You're right, Jim. Oh, I love these. They're very interesting projects when they do come up when a house is moved. So if you have either a sense that your house has moved or something that you come across that maybe a rumor or something like that, there are a couple of different ways that you can handle this, and it really depends on what information you have. Now, a good place to start is actually contacting the Harris County archivists. You want to ask for a tax appraisal record because they often have the shapes of the houses. So it's a way to kind of see if like that matches a Sanborn map, and maybe you can kind of tell that way if that's the same house or a different house. It can also often, hopefully, this is when it's a little bit easier, but sometimes it'll actually say that the house was moved there. Now, rarely does it say, in my experience, where it was moved from, but that's a good confirmation, and it'll often have the date. So once you have the date, it can lead you to some other resources that you can check. But that's the first place that I always start if I have any sense that this house was moved. Now, what can complement that is the Sanborn fire insurance maps, because again, you can see, search there and see, was there a house on that property prior, the current property that you're looking at? Does it match the footprint of the current house that's there, or is it very close? And then if possible, you want to see, does it show up again on a later Sanborn insurance map? Because it might. And that might also either confirm that it's the same house or that it's a different house because the footprint may have changed. So that's a really good way to support it. And third, you can use the help of like residents. So appraisal record might have the resident name on there of like, you can see where they moved before. You can track that property by street directory and see if there was a prior resident that shows up living there for a while and then disappears, and then see where they moved. Sometimes it will match the tax appraisal record, and then you can tell like, oh, perhaps they're the ones that moved the property, and it may say their name. So then you'll have a confirmation that way and can also search through that alternate avenue. But those are very interesting situations. So yeah.
Yeah, it can be tough, but it's not impossible.
It's not.
Sometimes it is, but it's often not.
Yeah, and it can help too to search it by the Houston Chronicle Archive, because if it's a more prominent house, It could show up on there. A sketch could show up on there, which will give you a better idea. It's like, oh, this is, a previous house. Or if it doesn't fit in the neighborhood, that's another sign that it was moved from elsewhere. So, you can also kind of use those context clues, like do some of the historic houses around there look like it? If it's in a style that's very common in another neighborhood, then that might give you an indication of where it might be moved from. So those are other kind of context clues you can use to determine that.
It's true. And a lot of times, I mean, it was rare, especially in the old days, for houses to move across town. A lot of times they would move around the corner, they would move from one block to another. It's not often that you see a house that is picked up and moved to a totally different neighborhood, although sometimes you do.
Yeah, every now and then.
Yeah.
But you can also see on the Sanborn fire insurance maps, like look at the streets around it. For one of the properties that we did a protected landmark designation from, it was actually just moved from another street. And I figured that out by looking at the Sanborn fire insurance maps, because there was an identical house down the street in one year. And then in following years, that lot was empty, but this lot had a house on it. And then from the fire tax appraisal records, I saw that same year that it said house was moved. So that's kind of how I put those pieces together. So that's also one way that you can tell. And like Jim said, there are things that are like kind of more typical, right? So it's more likely that it was moved from around following streets. So you could use that information.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that brings us to a close, and thanks to everybody for sending in those great questions, and thanks to you ladies for all your wonderful answers. I think people have a lot to work with here. Do keep an eye out for that follow-up email, and we'll send you some of the resources that we mentioned, so you'll have them all in one place. And if you do have any follow-up questions, you can reach Preservation Houston at contact@preservationhouston.org. And Sam?
Samantha.Bruer, BRUER, not 07, don't email me personally, at houstontx.gov, or txr.reference@houstontx.gov.
Okay. And there was something else that I was going to say about that, but could you just mention briefly again the HMRC's hours and operating capacity right now?
Yes, currently we are open research only, only the Texas room, not the rest of the Idison building, Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4. We're also answering phones and emails at that time. There is no parking. Generally, we have parking in the Central Library garage. It's a mess. There's lots of construction going on, but we do have a list of area garages and their pay rates that we can send you. So if you have any questions about coming in or what resources we have, we can also kind of schedule you an appointment to get you started, and maybe it'll be a little easier to get all that information to you at once.
And some great resources there. I would encourage everybody, if you don't have a Houston Public Library card, get one. It's free and it's wonderful, and it unlocks all sorts of things. Also keep an eye on the HPL website for upcoming events that are library related, and our website, preservationhouston.org, for upcoming events that relate to Houston architecture and history. One of the things that I'm excited about, in July, we're going to be beginning a online program series focused on Glenwood Cemetery for their 150th anniversary. So talking about the local cemeteries, the Glenwood is a great one. So I hope to see you back at other programs for both organizations. Oh, there's David.
Was that specifically about Glenwood, Lynn, or just cemetery?
Both. I love them. I love Glenwood.
Yep, Glenwood's great. And cemeteries are great too. But thanks to everybody again for being here, and hope we'll see you all again soon, and have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Night.